I'm Carrie Ann, and welcome back for another episode of Earn Your Right. In the last episode, we discussed what the different levels or layers to our government in the United States are. And we talked about, in broad strokes, the different branches of government at each level and in very basic terms, described what they are responsible for. In this video, I want to get into more detail on the relationship between the federal, state, and local governments, and essentially have a discussion about who is responsible for what. Because the one thing I find is that people often don't know which level or layer of government is responsible for the law they don't like or can help them solve the problem that they're having. And that makes sense. Our government is set up in a somewhat complicated way. So I hope to clarify that. And I think the best place to do that is to start with some of the constitutional provisions that provide for this separation of power between the federal and state governments and how it was all designed to work in the first place. So let's start with the fact that the federal government is supposed to be a limited government, one of enumerated or numbered powers. And what does that mean? That means that anytime a government is created, that is the people giving up some of their freedoms in order to be governed, right? And we're giving away some of our power, some of our freedom, and we are allowing this government to tell us, what we can and cannot do. Why do we do that? Well, to live in a civilized, organized society, essentially, at the core. So we have this federal government, which was not designed to be the most powerful level or layer of government. They were given enumerated or limited powers. And this was very important at the time that the Constitution was created, to make sure that the federal government was not too powerful. And so the first part of the Constitution I want to talk about governing this relationship is the 10th Amendment. And the 10th Amendment says that any powers that were not explicitly given to the federal government are left to the states and the citizens themselves and the people, right? So they remain with the states and the people. So that means that the federal government can only they can only legislate, create laws within their scope of power. And if they want to do something outside their scope of power, it's either going to be found to be unconstitutional, or they have to incentivize the states and the people to do what they want, but cannot force it. So over the years, through history, we have seen the power and the reach of the federal government grow, and perhaps grow beyond what was intended. The states were intended to hold more of the power. And that makes sense if you think about how each state, we have the United States of America, but look at Europe, for example. Before the European Union, you had all of these little countries with their different cultures and customs and languages, all having to figure out how to interact and work together as neighbors. We're not that different in the way we're set up in the United States in terms of having states having unique cultures. People live places because they believe the people there share similar values to them. They like the same types of activities. Whatever the case may be, having power concentrated at the state level really makes sense when you're thinking about having some independence and not wanting an overbearing, overreaching federal government. But that being said, if we wanted the cohesiveness of being one big country, we had to figure out a way to make the federal government's say final and binding in those areas where they have the right to legislate in the first place. And so that's where the concept of the supremacy clause and preemption come in. So under the supremacy clause, it says that the law that comes from the federal government is the supreme law of the land. It reigns supreme over state laws or local laws. Now, important to understand that it has to be an area that they can regulate in order for the supremacy clause to be invoked. So once they met that threshold that this is one of their powers, then they can regulate there, and it's going to be supreme. Hand in hand with supremacy is preemption. And preemption says that if there is a state law that conflicts with the federal law, then the state law is going to be preempted, meaning that the federal law is going to come first. And so if they conflict and the federal law is valid because of the supremacy clause, the state law will be preempted, and you would have to follow the federal law in that case. And so because the federal government has these enumerated specific powers, another constitutional provision that helps to sort of understand this relationship is the necessary and proper clause, which I define and explain to my students as the helper clause. And what the necessary and proper clause says is that Congress can do, or the federal government can do, what it needs to do in order to implement its power. So Congress has its constitutionally provided for power. And if there's something sort of related to that they need to do, then they can do it in order to actually use their power. So creating banks is a great example of that, right? If they're going to have taxing and spending power, it makes sense for them to have a place to put money to create banks. If they can print money, they also make sense for them to have a bank. So something like that, where it doesn't specifically say in the Constitution that they can create banks, it's been interpreted through the judicial branch, which we'll talk about another time, that through the necessary and proper clause, this thing kind of makes sense. All right, so we have what the federal government does, or that they have limited powers. We have what the state government does, that power was really supposed to be concentrated there. Now we have the local governments, which they derive their power explicitly and solely from the state. I am not an expert on all 50 states. I wouldn't pretend to be. That's how it works in New York. They derive their power from the state, but that is typically how it works. Right? They set forth all of the rules. They don't just exist on their own. They get the power to govern from the states, whether that comes from the constitution of the state or some other mechanism can vary. So whereas the states and the people have given power to the federal government, the states are the ones who give all the power that they get to the federal government. And so you can have weaker municipalities who are really sort of just acting on behalf of the federal government, or you could have stronger, on behalf of the state government, or you can have stronger municipalities who are given more broad power to regulate in that area. Okay, that feels like a good stopping place for this video. To recap, what we've covered today is what that relationship between the state, federal, and local governments looks like in terms of the power structure. You can think of the next video I'm going to do as a part 2 of this, where we're going to get into a little bit more of what are some of those specific powers and talking about examples of what it looks like when the federal government is regulating, when the state is regulating, and how to figure out who is actually responsible for solving a problem or creating a particular rule. So do come back for the next video. I will look forward to seeing you.